Hello, Sister Giulia.
Buongiorno, Chiara.
Buongiorno. Would you tell us about the influence that the studies and publication on the Middle Ages and Dante by Joseph Garrow, Robert Davidsohn, and Adolfo Mussafia have had for developing the studies on the Divina Commedia and more in general on the work of the great poets in England and in the Anglo-Saxon countries?
What I find wonderful about being custodian of this English cemetery in Florence in the middle of traffic, where you step back into time into the 19th century, where foreigners came to Florence with great enthusiasm and love for the city, especially for its poet Dante and for its great artists like Giotto, and also the architecture of Arnolfo di Cambio. And what was interesting in that period, in the 19th century, that was the period when the Houses of Parliament were rebuilt in London. It was a period of great interest in democracy. And so in the 20th century, instead, there was this love of the Medici. But in the 19th century, instead, it is of the Duecento and the Trecento rather than the Quattrocento. And Dante was seen as the great liberator. And what I love about the scholars we have here is that they are so international. Joseph Garrow, who translates the Vita novel for the first time into the English language, he is the son of an Indian princess and he marries a Jewess. And he's greatly admired by, for instance, Thomas Adolphus Trollope, who is his son in law, who marries his daughter Theodosia. And it's a lovely edition, parallel text. And he's buried here with Thomas Adolphus's epitaph in Latin. Elizabeth Barrett Browning is buried here, and she writes about Dante in Casa Guidi Windows. And we are now publishing her poetry in Italian under the title O Bella Libertà. And in that, of course, is not only Aurora Lee, but Casa Guidi Windows, Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point. And as well, we have Walter Savage Landor, who wrote Imaginary Conversations. And one of them, he imagines Dante and Beatrice talking about his poetry when they were very young adolescents together, communing over a wall like Pyramus and Thisbe. And, uh, and it's enchanting. And I've only just realized that I need to add him to the list of the scholars we're discussing and Dante lovers. So also we have Frances Trollope and Hiram Powers, who Frances Trollope traveled with her children. Her husband was an incompetent lawyer and she had to find a way to support her family. And she traveled up the Mississippi River. And when she got to Cincinnati, she met the young Hiram Powers, who was part Native American. And together they did waxworks of Dante's Inferno on the American frontier. And then he came to Florence and became professor at the Accademia de Belle Arti and sculpted the White Slave, which was the very center of the Crystal Palace exhibition about liberation from slavery. And she had already written a Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw against slavery, which she saw firsthand, including lynching going up the Mississippi River. And then, of course, we have other scholars. Robert Davidsohn, who came from Gdansk, who is Jewish, who spent his life researching in the archives in Florence and wrote the most magnificent history of medieval Florence. If you want to study Dante's background, you need Villani's Storia di Firenze and Robert Davidson's many volumes, which I used to cart across the Atlantic over and over again to do my work on Dante's teacher, Brunetto Latini. And as well, there is Adolfo Mussafia, again Jewish, from Trieste, who asked to be buried in Florence rather than under the oppression of the Austrians because of his love for Dante. And he has a beautiful tomb here with his portrait on it, which is exactly the same features as his grandson has, who's professor at the University of Florence. And I was delighted to realize that. And the grandson, is a member of our association, the Aria Anello Association. As well, we have two wives. The wife of Domenico Comparetti, she is Jewish and Russian. Elena Comparetti, she's part of the family of Don Lorenzo Milani Comparetti.
Mm.
And she was great on education, especially for women. And then we have a Russian tomb where the husband, who is a Dante scholar in Russia, Kudrjacev, laments the death of his wife, saying that he is left, he doesn't say widowed, he says orphaned, because he looks up above the tomb above hers, where there is the baby lamenting the death of its mother of a Swiss in a Swiss family. So we thought that we could put together a ceremony where we carried wreaths of laurel and to the Dante scholars and lovers, and perhaps two of roses to the two wives, to celebrate this cosmopolitan aspect of Dante, this global love of the great poet of Florence. Because we're all, those of us involved with the English cemetery, we are all like Dante in exile. But the Commedia undoes the exile, and instead of ending tragically, ends, as he says, Commedia. And what I love about the title, his son says he takes it from the plays of Terence, Publius Terentius Afer, who was a freed black slave whose plays were performed in Rome, much admired, and who says, Homo sum, humani nihil a me alienum puto.
Mm.
I am human, nothing human is alien to me, which undoes discrimination, racism, and so forth, and racism's use as slavery, instead speaking for freedom. And in his plays, the women and slaves come out on top. And Dante's son says that his father structures the poem as a Roman theatre in the round. I got rather upset when we did this wonderful production of music of Dante's Commedia, and our modern world is linear and square boxes. And my wonderful musicians ended up doing everything as if it were linear and square boxes. And I was saying, no, everything that you do with Dante has to be in circles. Fibonacci curves, natural shapes, not unnatural ones. And so I've been talking too much. I must give you a chance to ask
No, no,
questions.
no, no. It's okay, and it's very interesting what you're saying, and it gives a different, it puts a different life or light on the whole thing and the whole scene of Dante scholars in Florence at that time. So thank you very much. I'm gonna go to the next question anyway. So in 1974, you obtained a PhD from Berkeley University, USA, with a doctoral thesis in English and comparative literature entitled The Figure of the Pilgrim in Medieval Poetry. Speaker Professor Philip W. Damon published in English as The Pilgrim and the Book, a study of Dante, Langland, and Chaucer. And in 2012, it was also published in an Italian translation with the title Il Pellegrino e il Libro, uno studio su Dante. Would you please tell us about it?
Yes. I was working with the Dante's Allegory, where and also two other major 14th century poems, English ones, Chaucer and Langland. In all three of these, the author is present within the text, and he presents himself as being rather stupid, like Pinocchio, and having to learn because he stands in for you, the reader, and he is less intelligent than you are, when really he's much more intelligent. So he's playing a game in which he teaches you how to distinguish folly from truth and so on, lies from truth and so on. And I was seeing this as incarnational allegory. Uh, Jesus becomes flesh and blood in our world, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. Dante is flesh and blood, but not. He's fiction as well as fact. And this is what Pietro da Alighieri says throughout his commentary on his father's poem. That his father's poem is fiction, but it is also fact. It's this wonderful paradox. And then they all use paradigms from the Bible. Luke 24, which is where the two pilgrims journeying away from Jerusalem, sorrowing because Jesus is dead on the cross. And they're joined by a third pilgrim, and they say, surely you know what's been happening in Jerusalem. You must be a stranger not to know about it, when it is Jesus himself. And they recognize him finally in the breaking of the bread and the wine. And Dante uses that in the Vita Nuova and in the wonderful Statius episode in Purgatorio. And also the other poets similarly use that. They also use the Exodus theme. Dante bases his allegory on Psalm 113 when Israel went out of Egypt and so forth. And that was sung to a unique tonus peregrinus, the Hebrew music of the pilgrims going to the temple, which they did 3 times a year. And that was maintained in the Christian church as well as in the Hebraic liturgy. And Dante plays a game with music in the text, where he begins with the earliest form of music. The pilgrims are singing this in Purgatory at the opening. And then he progresses through those psalms he would have heard in Gregorian chant in the Badia when he was a boy growing up almost next door. And then also, as he gets towards Ravenna and he's writing the Commedia, he then incorporates polyphony. So he does a music history and as well as a geography of his exile from being a citizen to being an exile and so on. And I've been finding that to study Dante, you really need to perform him. You need to participate with him. That's the game he's playing. But the problem is modern education has taught us to be, white lab coats, detached observers, distancing, as we have to do with COVID. And it's not the way a medieval text was meant to be. A medieval text was full of sound and color and images and music, and we've obliterated that. And I think that's why I found it so sad when I came to Italy that the young people and the scholars in the libraries, the Italians, were telling me they hated Dante. And I realized it's because he's taught so badly. He's taught boring. But if they restore these dimensions, which the teenagers have with their iPhones and so on and so forth, their visual, their oral, if we can restore Dante back into that, because he was reading his texts at court, and when he mentioned a psalm line, his audience would have heard the music of the Gregorian chant from their memory of that being sung in the church's liturgy. So that's what I've tried to do on the web. And I have this website called Dante Vivo after Giovanni Papini's book, where he say problem is that Dante is not being taught well, that we need to revise our mode of teaching him. And what I've done there is to give each canto the scribal text. I've recorded an actor from the Mugello before he died. We recorded all of the Commedia. He's reading it cantastorie, the way the contadini recite Dante. They recite him with the poetry. I also got my son to change the long playing records into MP3s of Theatre Dantesco of 50 years ago, where the scholars are reading him. And the scholars read him like prose, and it's so dull. And so I've got these two letture side by side, and you can click on which one you want to. And I've also, with it, the Temple Classics Dante, which I stole from my father and love, which he had stolen from Hastings Public Library, in which my will will denote back to Hastings Public Library. It's got
Sometime.
all decay in one volume, bound in one volume. I read that aloud, so in English, so you can choose whether the two Italian versions or the English version. And with it, I've also given the manuscript illuminations of the cantos. And as well, the backdrop is from the Botticelli and Blake drawings. And the Botticelli, he understood how Dante was performed as drama. The figures move just the way they do in the Terence manuscript illuminations. And it's a theatre. And then, as well, we have given the music. And I'm very grateful to Federico Badazzi with the Ensemble San Felice. We performed these 2 hour concerts in Cologne, Avila, Graz, or San Michele, Ravenna, and the Duomo. And it was such an exciting experience to to hear the text sensually. And we did it also with the images. So that you can find on YouTube, Musica della Commedia, and prepare to find 2 hours of time to go through. Of course, there isn't music in the Inferno, so it's Purgatorio and Paradiso. And some of the music is exquisite. We went to the original manuscript of the period and performed these, and one doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. It was already there, and it's more profound, I think, and profoundly moving than a superficial modernizing of the text. I think if we delve into it more deeply, the love will come, the understanding will come.
Definitely, it used to be more totalizing experience to read Dante with the part, with the music as well as you say, and it was a way of sharing an experience actually to me as you telling it, and so it was more moving because there were other people to share this moment together, with you.
Yeah,
And so it's, I think, what actually is difficult for us in this moment where we can't actually share any of our experience with other people, with the people that are really next to us and mean to us a lot, because we have to stay apart. But yeah,
right.
it's a nice way to see it, and it's a nice way to reinterpret this great
Yes. That's why we've done the Academia Bessarium in this time of COVID, where scholars around the world can share and discuss things. If you want to do the condividere di schermo, let's see if we can find it.
you
No,
should.
it's not, it's disabled. So I did on the 6th of April at 8 o'clock European time, and we will have participants from all over Iceland, Boston, and so forth, Boulder, England, and we've got a lovely group of people. We began by doing it on Dante's Vita Nuova and describing the geography of the center of Florence, the historical center of Florence, with the fake Dante house and the real Dante house, which is now Il Pinello. And where we have been doing readings of the Commedia, we have actually, with ordinary people, read the Commedia 3 times and the Vita Nova once, and then halfway through again, and then COVID happened. So we then went on the web with it and used the photographs, images, engravings, and so forth, showing where Dante had lived. And also, we've done a percorso, an app with the lapidi dantesche, which were put up with the previous great celebration of Dante all over the city of uh, ancient city of
Of
Florence, with
Florence, yeah.
the various palaces he mentions and so on. And because what's wonderful about Dante's allegory, it's the biblical form of allegory, not the classical form of allegory. Classical form of allegory, it's all abstracted into virtues and vices. Uh, the biblical form is incarnational. It's tangible, it's concrete. And also the Hebrew language is like that in the distinction. The Greek, it tends to be very intellectual and not rooted in concrete reality. Instead, it's a Platonic ideal and so forth. Whereas Dante catches on to the aspect of he's describing real places, real people. He's using them fictionally to teach. Um, he hasn't, I mean, he has no right to put people in hell, really. But he can if they are there to save the reader. And there was a wonderful science fiction story. A student gave it to me at Princeton. It's the Commedia set in the modern world, and Dante is traveling with Benito, and they go through all of these circles of hell, cruising cars dashing around. You have to evade them, and so on and so forth. Finally, you get to the very bottom, and Benito has to sacrifice himself to save Dante. And at that point, I realized it's Benito Mussolini. And it's a wonderful modernizing of Dante. I was saying don't modernize Dante, but that one was beautifully done, where you need to get the pharmakos, the sacrificial victim, the Barabbas, and so forth, and to heal. And that also, there was a when I was working on Chaucer and these pilgrimage allegories, there were two Norwegian scholars who talked about the anthropology. If you go to the Great Mother, there's a labyrinth before, and you travel with the staff. That's Virgil Virga. And as you get to the center, if you don't sacrifice yourself or your Virga, you don't make it. So Virgil has to be sacrificed, and he's a kind of alter ego per Dante for Dante. And of course, it's very sexual symbolism at the same time, the staff and the labyrinth and so on. But that is there in the power of the Commedia, the layers of allegory that you have, and why you need a virtuous pagan who's not saved, who saves the sinning Christian. And Dante, I think it's very important to realize that Dante presents himself sinning as with pride in the beginning, and then he progresses when he is stooped down beside Giotto, Cimabue, etc., Franco da Bologna, etc. He learns humility. And he learns humility also from Beatrice. He's still making mistakes. When he gets all the way up to paradise, and he and Cacciaguidi are talking, and Cacciaguidi saying we need a Florence that goes back to simplicity, leather belts, and so on and so forth. And Dante goes off on this tangent about how noble his ancestors are. A says Beatrice. And she coughs as she does, remembering Ginevra, the story, the Arthurian story, where the coughing is against the adultery of Lancelot and Guinevere. So, in a sense, I loved my when I did my doctoral orals at Berkeley. Louise Clubb, who became director of Itati, she said the celestial rose is like a Quaker meeting. The women and men are equal, the old and the new are equal. There is no rank, there is no hierarchy. Hierarchy was a word that was invented by Pseudo Dionysius, who lied, pretending he was contemporary with Christ. And then it became very convenient for emperors and kings, and Gothic architecture is based on it. But in the Gospel, Jesus is for the leper, the Samaritan, the woman, the outsider, the other, and everyone is equal. Um, those in power will be, as Mary says in the Magnificat, thrown down from their thrones and so forth. And that is Dante's ultimate vision, is seeing the face of God. Mi pare pinta nelle nostre fiche. We have that face of God. And I loved a recent discussion from Jerusalem on slavery in the free religions, where the comment was made that Constantine forbade the branding of slaves on the face because the face is the image of God. And I think if we can undo racism, we can undo exile, etc. If we can come to that wisdom of the sanctity of all human life, which Dante does in his poetry, he sanctifies us as readers by teaching us humility and so forth, and by setting himself up as a fall guy, as the pharmakos, the sacrificial victim. Sorry, that was a telephone.
It's very interesting, this interpretation of the the trouble of Dante as a way of discovering humility, and it's a different point of view on the whole story itself.
Yes. It's not the statue in Santa Croce.
No, it's not exactly the same thing. Yeah. So, you mind if we go on with the third question?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, as you are a professor emeritus in medieval studies at the University of Colorado, USA, and you also are author, as we said, of numerous offline and online publications. So you have organized a considerable number of international conferences, as we said, and many of which have examined the figure of Dante. Then you have also traveled widely the world, visiting, just to number a few, Brazil, Austria, Israel, Sinai, Sweden, Iceland, Russia, or Romania. So you also made many pilgrimages to Canterbury, Rome, Compostela, Jerusalem, and also in Sinai. And you speak many languages and have citizenship in 3 different countries. So having said all of these, in your opinion, which is the country or the countries that most appreciate and understand Dante's work?
I'm hoping that Italy will deepen and love Dante more than I'm finding she does at present. And perhaps with this celebration, that can be changed. I hope it can, because Dante is a great soul healer, and we need that. He's teaching us the right lessons for good government and for, well, mental health and so forth. I find England loved Dante, especially in the 19th century, and did a great deal of translating and so forth. I especially love Dorothy Sayers' translation, which she was doing while she was actually in the air raid shelter during the war and the flying bombs, which I also lived through as a child. And but America is a country that has deeply invested in the teaching of Dante. And I think in some ways its scholars see Dante more deeply than do Italian scholars, who have been sort of locked into a rather formal philological study, which isn't as productive as it could be if it could um, go out, think outside the box, become more sensual instead of only intellectual. Because Dante is not only intellectual. He is intensely sensual, and this is something which was also said by Edgar de Breen about medieval ascetics, that it involves all of the five human senses simultaneously in a richness as a way of reaching beyond those to the ideal intellectual. But you cannot reach that if you are devoid of the sensuality. It is essential for it. Um, and so I appreciated greatly teaching Dante to American students, finding that they could, from a tabula rasa, grasp it. And I would always concentrate on the Purgatory. I would give the major scenes in the Inferno, but the Purgatory, I would say, this is America. Ulysses sails across the Atlantic until he comes to Nuova Terra, and this is us. And then I would describe how the mountain of Purgatory is Monte Cecere, with its galleries, which were then Pietraserena. It was the English in the 19th century who planted the beautiful cypress trees. But before that, it was those galleries of stone you so often see in Florentine miniatures and manuscripts and paintings. And also, it is Mount Sinai. It was a wonderful book by John Desmarais, who went to Mount Sinai. He didn't climb it because he got tourist trots. So I went and I climbed it. I was climbing it, and the doctor beside me was very upset because he said I shouldn't be because I had a bad heart. But I managed to get to the top. And it is extraordinary because it is the terraces with the gates at which the monks of Mount St. Catherine's heard the Pilgrim's Confessions. It is the landscape that Dante gives to the Purgatory. Not in that my father took me to Casamaris Abbey years ago, and in the pharmacy, the monk brought out the medicines for the contadini who came, penicillin and so forth. One had a sore on his arm, and the monk reached out for one of these great apothecary jars and a feather, and dipped the feather in the ointment and placed it on the wound. Now, what could be more soft than a feather? Not exactly hygienic, perhaps, but that is Dante's description of the wounds of the seven P's being removed by the angel's wing. And there again, it's an actual tangible act in medieval culture, which he's placing into the fiction of his poetry. But it is fact, a factual practice. And I think that's what we need to grasp in Dante's poetry, that it's always reaching out of the book, the text, into reality and saying, yes, he does, up in Paradise, he says, reader down on your bench, look here, and so on. It's that practice of the presence, which is also true of medieval art. When you get, for instance, the Masaccio Trinity in Santa Maria Novella, this is later than Dante, but the two donors, you identify with them in the presence of Mary and John at the crucifixion, and the dove and God the Father. And below is the skeleton, as I was, so will you be, and so forth. This is what Dante's text does to us. It reaches out beyond the text. And I'll never forget going to an exhibition of Chinese paintings in San Francisco that had come from Taiwan. And there were these old Chinese grandmothers in front of me telling the grandchildren, you become the person in the scroll painting. You are within the painting, and you listen to the stream, the wind rustling in the trees, and so forth. That is medieval art. And then later we got into the picture frame art where we are beyond it, we are outside of it, we're divorced from it. They weren't. And if we can learn to step back in, like Alice in Wonderland, Alice through the looking glass, back into these playful texts, because they're playing games, there's a wonderful humor in Dante, which the statue in Santa Croce has forgotten, and so on.
Yeah, and it's all about stepping back into the frame, as you said, and feeling part of the picture, complete picture.
Square
So
boxes.
yeah,
Thinking outside the
yeah,
box.
it's,
Yes.
that's what you
Yes.
said actually. Yeah, you're right. And another important personality linked to Dante and buried in the English cemetery is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, another great 19th century American scholar who sojourned in Florence, as a plaque in Piazza Santa Maria Novella
Yeah.
records. Longfellow, since 1864, spent several years translating the Divina Commedia, getting help from friends. He invited to weekly meetings in perfecting the translation and correcting the drafts. And these gatherings were attended by, among others, William Dean Howells, James Russell Lowell, and Charles Eliot Norton, who created was
Yes.
later called the Dante Club, yeah? And who, under the leadership of Longfellow, also
Yes.
founded in 1881 the Dante Society of America. So if you want to tell us about it a little bit.
Right. Um, I don't
So,
have much to say about that because I was more involved in the English appreciation of Dante
okay,
than I was with the that aspect of American foundation of of. But
that's okay. Don't worry, we can just keep the question and go to the next
yes,
one, or just talk
I
about
mean
something
the
different.
novel about the murder in the Dante Society stuff I think was a bit superficial.
No,
But
no, it was just to say something about this occasion.
yes,
This
I think this does happen, just as Dante shows the poets and their friendships together and their influences upon each other with the Dolce Stile novel. This also happens with the scholars of Dante, and that we sort of end up with love-hate relationships with each other. If we are jealous, which is one of the sins, it's not productive. But if instead we are open to each other's concepts, I love Baransky telling me it was all right for me to respond in a conference given in Dublin on Zoom, and because I always feel as though I'm the neophyte, I'm the outsider. I've been outside of academia, going into my convent, and I've exiled myself from that academic world. But now, outside of the frame, I'm sort of doing my own academia Basarian and really enjoying that because it it's more productive if you can break the barriers, the frame, if you can break outside of it.
yeah,
Right.
it gives you more freedom to just go follow what you
Right. And
think it's
also, I think it's
interesting.
important for the women. Christine de Pizan wrote a wonderful version of the Commedia in the 15th century. She had to support her family. She was left widowed. She was Italian, brought to Paris, and given the run of the King's Library when she was a young girl. So she was studying all of the classics and Boccaccio and Dante and Brunetto. And then when she had to support her family, she set about writing Le Chemin de Longitude, the road of long study, directly quoting Dante, where she herself in grey is escorted by the Sibyl in pink. Now, this is copying the manuscript illuminations where Dante is in blue in the text as an apprentice scholar, learner, and Virgil is in red, whereas Dante outside the text is in red as a teacher. And she describes this journey where she is taught by the Sibyl everything of this wonderful ladder going up to God, which is from the Paradiso. And then it ends with a teaching about good government, which is what Brunetto Latino had been teaching to Dante. And she illuminated it beautifully, presented it to the Queen of France, and so on. And then we have the women scholars like Dante Gabriel Rossetti's sister, Maria Rossetti, wrote a wonderful commentary on the sort of Anglo-Catholic commentary. Their father, who was the atheist exile, had written a very fine commentary, but from his perspective, and then she countered it with her perspective, bringing back into it the spiritual aspects. And then also you have Dorothy Sayers, you have scholars now like Teodolinda Barolini, you have Allegretti, Paola Allegretti of the Società Dantesca Italiana. Dante is also open to women, and I asked Amalia Chari Dupre to do a bottle of Dante and Beatrice because there's no statue of Beatrice in Florence. And she did a beautiful one. The Swiss said, no, we can't have it on the empty niche in Viale. Come si chiama? It's not Gramsci, it's the other one. By in the cemetery, which would have been the gate that Dante and Beatrice would have gone out to the countryside in the summers when they were children. And it's a lovely image because Beatrice is shorter than Dante, but she's teaching him. And it's a wonderful depiction of what also Walter Savage Landor gets into in his imaginary conversations with Pericles and Aspasia, Dante and Beatrice. This inclusion of the woman, for which we need to value Dante's text so much, instead of the pagan infernal part, is with Virgil is known to be homosexual, and it's a male culture. And then Dante is able to go beyond that into the heterosexual culture of Jesus's gospel, which includes women. And so I see the Commedia as journeying from the tragedy of exclusion and the problems that they had with the feuds, the vendettas, corso donati, bad government, to the harmony of good government, of the Celestial Rose, um, the college where Christ is abbot, and the abbot practices humility and washes the feet of the new novice entering the abbey, and as Christ does to his disciples.
Yeah, it's moving in some way. And yeah, but about exclusion and people who are excluded, um, you actually in your life um, have been studying and teaching, but also you committed to citizenship education and defense of rights of ethnic minorities, and in particular the Roma people, right?
Yeah,
And so,
this has been a bit of the miracle that that the Swiss trusted me. with a bit of reluctance because I was Catholic and they are Protestant, um, with the custodianship of the abandoned cemetery, which was in very bad shape. And I had no money. I retired early, so my pension was very small. It's still so small I can't become an Italian citizen. And but what happened was I found that one needed to save the Roma babies from being taken from them, which is a form of genocide. And in return, they restored the dry wall of the cemetery, which had collapsed, and all of the tombs were collapsing, including the Russian ones and so forth, and Theodore Parker, who was the great preacher against slavery. And I found that their history had been of slavery longer than were blacks. They were slaves in the Middle Ages until the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in Romanian. And then they were in the Holocaust, so it was double jeopardy for them. And they've never achieved civil rights, but they are world citizens. Their language is in China, it's in America, Australia, Europe, and so forth, in India, Rajasthan. And I also discovered from my friendship with them, which was based on saving their babies, we make cradles, rocking cradles together with them. And we've now won a Supreme Court case in Rome for the four children who were wrongly taken from their parents to at least be allowed to see them and to learn their story. Instead, they've been told they'd been abandoned, which they've internalized to their own damage. And this is not in the children's interest to have done this. And I found that actually the Roma have a wonderful oral culture, storytelling, like Apuleius' stories, even if they are illiterate, and that they're extremely intelligent and their manual skills are wonderful. One of them, who is educated, he has the high school diploma from the technical school, was so excellent that he was invited to participate in the restoration of Donatello's pulpit in Prato, Daniel Claudio Dumitrescu, and he's restored many of our tombs. And the others have done wonderful gardening. They've planted Florence's lily, the wild irises, and they've made the cemetery beautiful and very profitable for its owners. At the same time, we are all of us quite marginal, and we I don't spend money on books, but the books arrive in the library. We live in a kind of economy of giving instead of um, it's not a commercial economy. It's an economy based on love and inclusion, which I've found to be extremely productive. It's the way to go. It's the good society. It's buon governo. And I think of our island in um, the Island of the Dead, our cemetery, our oval, which is the shape of the human brain, which was also the shape of the Victorian libraries, the Panizzi Dome in the British Library, the wonderful circular library in Paris, which are now glass boxes, squares instead. But that there's this sense we are the microcosm of the macrocosm. And with the research we've done on the tombs, on our burials, their contributions intellectually, and also ideally they were working against slavery, against the use of children in mines and factories, for the rights of women, for the rights of nations, against empires and so forth. They were working for all the right causes, except now we see that nationalism is also a bane instead of something that's good. I'm now a victim of Brexit, and I wish I were not. I think we need to be citizens of the world and with the sense of the valuing of the human and also its ecology with nature. And this is what we also practice in the cemetery. We compost and we cycle, except I'm now forbidden my bicycle because I've broken my arm. And I think if we become the sort of leaven in the lump, if we set an example that show that it works, that it's not impractical, that perhaps we can make a bit of a difference. I would also add that we do library schools with the mothers. Instead of begging in the streets of Florence, sending the money home to the grandmothers looking after the children. We give them library schools and a stipend to stay with their children. It's the first time there are books in the house. And we gave each library school a children's illustrated Dante. And the Roma said, no, these pictures of hell, you do not show those to children. They're too traumatic. And they don't allow their babies to cry. They're always held, rocked, sung to. They do everything they can to make sure that the baby's brains are not damaged when they're small. And I applaud that. I think we need to learn from them. Good parenting, good families. Sorry, that's
That's
a Misericordia ambulance going by.
no, I mean it's it's important that it drives where it has to, but I didn't know many of these things you're saying about Roma people. Actually, it's not a culture that I know at all, for being honest. And it's very interesting the project you're taking care of, because it gives an alternative to these people that actually, I mean, maybe somehow it's their culture as well to have some kind of oral culture, as you said. It's their way of uh, going through history. They tell the history the way we used to do
Yes,
a long
yes.
time ago.
Which
It's a
Dante was
different
tapping
way.
into. And the way the contadini recite him by heart. And what I love is listening to the stories Diamanta and Yonel tell. Um, they're stories about how if you're kind to people, you will meet with kindness. If you're cruel, you will meet with cruelty. They're moral stories. And unfortunately, the Roma that we see in the streets have met with so much cruelty. We only see that side. We don't see the other. We don't see that forbidding them access to water to wash in the public fountains and so forth means that they become dirty. They keep the washing machine, as you heard, going all day long. They wash everything they wear every time they wear it. They love being clean, and they use all kinds of rituals about cleanliness, spiritual and physical, far more elaborately than we do, taboos that come all the way from India. And I've been very grateful for the privilege of actually living with them and learning about this and undoing my prejudices, because I had them. I was afraid of them. And now I'm being, with this broken arm and so forth, uh, I am being magnificently cared for, and I have to wake them up in the middle of the night for them to give me, injections and so forth, and they never complain. They, it's we reciprocate, and it's something so beautiful, something I never expected to 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 meet with. And so I'm terribly grateful for Italy, for the Roma, and here I am, a stranger in a strange land, but learning about Dante's teachings, learning about teachings of hospitality, and just I want to say thank you.
Grazie mille. È stata
Grazie.
veramente una bella intervista e grazie per il tempo anche e anche tutte le informazioni che mi ha dato. C'è tanto volendo da approfondire, c'è tanto da insomma, Grazie, mi è piaciuto
Grazie.
molto, è stata un'ora interessante davvero. Grazie mille.